No one expected Demet Özdemir to snap back this way. For weeks, the tension between her and CanYaman had been growing silently, an invisible pressure building beneath carefully chosen words, vague interviews, and social media speculation. Ken had been giving strange signals, speaking in half-truths, letting subtle accusations slip into conversations without ever naming Demet directly. And that was exactly the problem. He didn't have to say her name. Everyone already knew who he meant. Demet watched everything quietly at first. She didn't want drama. She didn't want headlines twisting her words or fans turning every sentence into a war. She had always been the one who stayed calm, who maintained her dignity, who refused to feed the fire. But then Ken said something small, something indirect, but sharp enough to cut through every layer of patience she had left. And that was the moment she answered with a single sentence that sent shockwaves across the internet. "Look in the mirror before you accuse me, Can." It was the kind of line that doesn't need shouting. It didn't need anger, threats, or insults. It was clean, sharp, and brutally honest. And that honesty rattled everyone, especially those who remembered just how much history these two shared. You could almost feel the weight behind her words, years of emotions, misunderstandings, unresolved memories, and silent disappointments. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a boundary, a limit, a line she was no longer letting him cross. People instantly understood that something real had happened behind all the polished public images. This wasn't about a random comment or a miscommunication. This was about a long, complicated connection, one that had been romantic, painful, intense, and unforgettable. A connection that fans still obsess over because no matter how much time passes, neither Demet nor Can fully escape the shadow of what they once had. And maybe that's exactly why her response hit so hard. Fans have always seen Demet as the warm one, the emotional one, the soft-hearted one who forgives easily. But her sentence revealed something new. She wasn't going to let him rewrite the truth. She wasn't going to let him make her the villain of a story they both lived. She wasn't going to carry the blame for both of them just because she stayed silent longer. Her voice wasn't angry, it was controlled. And that made it 10 times more powerful. It wasn't just a reaction to a single moment. It was everything she had chosen not to say for years, condensed into one perfectly delivered line. And the world felt it. On the other side, Can's behavior suddenly began to look different. His comments, his tone, even his hesitation when asked certain questions, it all pointed to unresolved feelings, unresolved frustration, and maybe even unresolved guilt. It was obvious that he was speaking from a place of emotion, whether he wanted to admit it or not. It wasn't the polished, media-trained version of Can people were used to. It was something rawer, something more personal. And Demet calling him out so directly made people ask a question they hadn't asked in a long time: what exactly happened between them that Can is still affected by? What wound did they both walk away with? And why, after all this time, was he still throwing shadows at her? Her response didn't just defend her. It exposed the fact that he wasn't innocent either. It showed that the blame he hinted at wasn't one-sided. It reminded everyone that whatever went wrong between them was shared, not carried alone. And just like that, the whole world shifted its attention. The silence they had both maintained for years cracked for the first time. And through that crack, a truth neither of them had planned to reveal started leaking out. A truth that suggested this story was far from over. After Demet's sentence shook the entire internet, something else happened, something even more telling than her words. Can went quiet. Not the usual public silence he uses to avoid gossip, but a tense, uncomfortable silence that felt full of thoughts he didn't want anyone to hear. People noticed immediately. His social media activity dropped. His responses and interviews became slower, tighter, more measured. The man who usually dominated conversations suddenly seemed unsure of what to say next. That alone told the world that Demet's message had reached him exactly the way she intended. Because when someone tells you to look in the mirror, it forces self-reflection. And if there's one thing Can has always struggled with, it's confronting his own emotional mistakes. He is strong, confident, charismatic, someone who knows his worth and isn't afraid to show it. But precisely because of that strength, he isn't used to being challenged by someone who knows him well enough to cut through his defenses. And Demet does. She always did. Fans started rewatching old clips of them, interviews, behind-the-scenes moments, scenes from their show. Suddenly, the old chemistry felt different. You could see how much he trusted her in small gestures, how she calmed him down with a look, how he softened around her in ways he didn't around anyone else. People began asking if that same closeness was the reason this conflict now felt so personal, so emotional, so heavy. Because normal ex-partners don't hit each other this hard with one sentence. Only people with unresolved feelings do. Meanwhile, journalists kept pushing the story further. They wanted a reaction from Can something. Anything. Even a vague comment would have turned into a headline within seconds. But he refused to talk. And maybe that was the most revealing part of all. If he had nothing to hide, he would have laughed off her comment. If she was wrong, he would have denied it instantly. But he didn't. Instead, he shut down every attempt to drag him into another interview about her. That silence became the loudest confirmation fans needed. Demet had touched a nerve. And while he was silent, Demet continued living her life with calm confidence. No extra comments, no dramatic posts, no cryptic messages. She said what she needed to say and moved on. That contrast, her composure and his sudden tension, made the situation even more intriguing. It painted a picture of a woman who had finally spoken her truth and a man who didn't know how to respond to it. People close to the industry began whispering that Can wasn't angry at Demet, he was frustrated with himself. That the things he hinted at weren't really accusations but reflections of his own unresolved emotions. And it made sense. Sometimes when people don't know how to deal with regret, they try to shift the focus away from themselves. Sometimes they lash out indirectly. Sometimes they pretend they're fine. And sometimes, they push the one person who knew them too well, hoping to provoke a reaction. If that was his plan, it worked, but not in the way he expected. Demet didn't crumble. She didn't apologize for something she didn't do. She didn't try to soothe his ego. She didn't play the role of the quiet, understanding woman anymore. Instead, she handed him the truth with surgical precision. And Can wasn't prepared for it. The more people analyzed the situation, the more obvious it became that their story was still layered. This wasn't two people who had moved on completely and forgotten what they once meant to each other. There was tension, emotion, unresolved dialogue, signs of a bond that ended, but not cleanly. Fans felt it. The media felt it. Even celebrities began hinting that some stories don't end just because people stop talking. But what truly made everything explode was the question no one could ignore anymore. If Demet and Can were really over, emotionally, mentally, completely, why did one sentence from her shake him this deeply? Why did his comments trigger her so sharply? Why did they still react to each other like this? Because endings don't create reactions like that. Only unfinished stories do. And no matter how much time passes, no matter how far apart they try to pull themselves, some bonds don't disappear, they simmer quietly until the slightest spark makes them burst back into flame. Demet's spark had been lit. Can was standing in the smoke. And the world was watching to see what would rise from it. As the days passed, something interesting began to happen. People stopped treating Demet and Can's situation like a simple celebrity conflict. It started feeling more like a story with chapters, layers, and hidden truths that no one had ever been allowed to see. And the deeper fans looked, the more they realized that this wasn't just about one comment or one clapback. This was about two people who had never fully closed a door that the world assumed was locked years ago. Demet's single sentence had created a silence around Can that felt heavier than any argument. He avoided cameras. His interviews suddenly shifted topics. Even his normally active fan pages noticed that he wasn't engaging the way he usually did. It was the type of quiet that comes from someone who is processing, not defending, not reacting, but actually thinking about what was said. And the fact that Demet had hit that part of him made her message even more powerful. People close to Can said he wasn't angry at her. If anything, he seemed reflective. He wasn't ranting or complaining or blaming her behind closed doors. He was quieter, more thoughtful. And when someone asked him privately why he wasn't firing back, he simply said, "Because she knows me." That alone revealed everything. He wasn't staying silent because he had nothing to say. He was staying silent because she touched a truth he hadn't wanted to face. Meanwhile, the internet kept growing louder with theories. Some believed their tension came from an old argument, something unresolved from their most intense days together. Others believed it came from things that happened after, the jealousy, the misunderstandings, the things left unsaid when they drifted apart. But everyone agreed on one thing: their story was way too emotional to be treated as just coworkers or just friends. Emotional reactions like these don't happen between two people who feel nothing. Demet, on the other hand, remained steady. She didn't post follow-up comments, didn't give interviews, didn't fan the flames. She let her sentence stand on its own, which only made it stronger. Because when someone says just one thing and then chooses absolute silence afterward, it tells the world, "I've said what needed to be said. I don't have to prove anything else." And maybe that confidence was what shook Can the most. It reminded him of who she truly is at her core, a woman who doesn't need to shout to be heard. A woman who knows her worth. A woman who stayed silent for years not because she was weak, but because she was protecting something, maybe him, maybe herself, maybe both. People began noticing something else too. Demet's life looked stable, calm, centered. She was working, smiling, moving forward. But there was a spark in her eyes now, an unmistakable sense of closure mixed with strength. It was the look of someone who had finally said what they had been holding in their heart for far too long. In contrast, Can's eyes looked tired. Not unhappy, just emotionally overloaded. The kind of tiredness a person feels when they're forced to confront something they've avoided. Fans began pointing out that this was the first time in years he looked like a man who didn't know what the next step should be. And that's when a new question began spreading online: was this really a fight, or the beginning of a long overdue conversation? Because sometimes people don't explode at each other because they hate each other. Sometimes they explode because there is still something there, something unresolved that refuses to die quietly. Experts in body language, in psychology, in relationships began talking about their situation. Many agreed on the same point: the intensity wasn't coming from anger. It was coming from connection. Deep connection. And deep connection doesn't disappear with time, it gets buried, waiting to resurface. Demet's message was the spark. Can's silence was the acknowledgement. And the public reaction was the fire growing around them. It felt like the universe had pushed them into a moment they couldn't avoid. A moment where the truth demanded to come to the surface, whether they liked it or not. Whatever had been left unsaid between them. Whatever emotion had been buried. Whatever wound had never fully healed. It was all rising now. And everyone watching could feel it. This wasn't the climax of their story. This was the moment the story finally changed direction. In the days that followed, the tension between Demet and Can reached a strange, electrifying point, one that didn't feel like the aftermath of a fight but the beginning of a confrontation that had been postponed for years. The world could sense it. Fans could sense it. Even the media, usually eager to exaggerate drama, started using softer words, as if they too understood that this wasn't a typical celebrity scandal. This was something far more delicate, far more personal, far more rooted in emotions that neither Demet nor Can had ever fully dealt with. Demet's single line had exposed more truth than dozens of interviews ever could. And people realized something important: she hadn't spoken from anger, she had spoken from experience. She wasn't denying something. She wasn't running away. She wasn't trying to blame him. She was reminding him, almost gently, that his story wasn't the only story that mattered. That the perspective he was hinting at wasn't the full picture. And that, sometimes, the person who stays silent the longest is the one who has the most to say. Meanwhile, insiders began noticing unusual movements around Can. He became less reactive, less defensive. Even people close to him whispered that he seemed off balance, like someone who had underestimated the impact of his own words and was now trying to navigate the consequences without making the situation worse. They said he replayed her sentence again and again in his head, trying to understand where it came from, what it meant, and why it hit him so deeply. And maybe the reason was simple: no one else could hold a mirror to him the way Demet could. They had shared too much. Laughed too hard. Fought too fiercely. Loved too deeply, whether openly or silently, for her words to feel like just a social media clapback. They came from someone who had seen him at his best and at his worst, who knew the layers behind the public persona, who understood the man behind the fame. And when someone like that speaks, you listen. The public began sensing this shift. People started wondering if Can's earlier comments weren't actually accusations, but echoes of old wounds. Wounds he hadn't healed, wounds he maybe didn't even fully understand himself. And Demet, by pushing back so directly, forced him to face the possibility that he had misinterpreted the past, rewritten parts of it in his mind, or buried his own role in the story. This is why everything suddenly became heavier. Not because they hated each other, but because they still cared enough to react. Hate is clean. Hate is final. Hate doesn't tremble when someone speaks. But what they were displaying wasn't hate. It was the discomfort of unfinished emotion. Demet's circle, on the other hand, seemed calm, too calm. Her friends weren't defending her loudly. They weren't creating narratives or adding fuel to the fire. That silence suggested one thing: she didn't need protection. She hadn't said anything she couldn't stand behind. And maybe, she hadn't said anything untrue. The contrast between them was striking. Demet looked composed, focused, grounded. Can looked conflicted, thoughtful, unsettled. It didn't take long for fans to begin asking the real question beneath the surface: if their story was truly over, why did this hurt so much, for both of them? Because ending a relationship, even a deep one, usually leads to clarity with time. But here? The more time passed, the more complicated everything seemed. Their reactions weren't the reactions of two people who had moved on. They were the reactions of two people who had tried to move on but failed to erase each other from their emotional lives. And that's when a new theory emerged online, one that spread faster than any headline: maybe this wasn't the end of their conflict. Maybe it was the beginning of their truth. As the dust began to settle, the world realized something neither of them ever planned to reveal: their story had chapters no one had read. The public had seen the beginning. The chemistry, the tension, the magic. They had felt the middle, the distance, the silence, the space that grew between them. But now, years later, they were witnessing something unexpected, an emotional aftershock strong enough to bring everything back into the spotlight. Demet's message wasn't a declaration of war. It was a reminder. A boundary. A request for honesty. And Can's reaction, his hesitation, his silence, his visible struggle, proved that her words touched the part of him that still remembered how complicated, fragile, and real their connection once was. Maybe they will never say the full truth publicly. Maybe they will never sit in front of a camera and explain what went wrong. Maybe they will never define what they still feel. But one thing is certain: people don't react like this to someone they have forgotten. Demet's strength showed she had healed. Can's silence showed he hadn't. And the world now understands the full meaning of her sentence, not as an attack, but as a final piece of honesty between two people whose story will never fully disappear. Not because it ended badly. Not because it ended too soon. But because some stories don't end at all. They simply change shape.